On the morning of August 4th, 2026, 25 state attorneys general walked into the U.S. Court of International Trade and did something that would have been almost unthinkable a decade ago. They sued their own federal government to stop a president's tariffs on Canada and 59 other trading partners. Not Ottawa, not Beijing. Washington, D.C. itself was the target. For 18 months, the story of the trade war between the United States and Canada had been told as a fight between two countries, two leaders, two flags. But by the summer of 2026, the real fault line wasn't running along the 49th parallel anymore. It was running straight through the middle of the United States, between a White House determined to keep collecting tariff revenue and a coalition of state governments insisting that revenue was coming out of American pockets, not Canadian ones. To understand how the country got here, you have to go back to February 3rd, 2025. That's the day President Donald Trump signed the executive order that started all of this, invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy products. The stated justification was border security and fentanyl trafficking. Canada's government did not sit still. Ottawa answered with retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods, and within 3 weeks, as the dispute deepened, that number climbed to $155 billion in Canadian counter-tariffs. What had been, for decades, one of the most stable and cooperative trading relationships on Earth turned almost overnight into an open economic confrontation between two G7 allies. To put that opening escalation in context, it helps to remember what the U.S. Canada trading relationship actually looked like before any of this started. For decades, Canada and the United States operated under one of the deepest economic integrations between any two countries on the planet, first under the original Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, then under NAFTA, and later under its successor, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which Canadians typically call CUSMA. That 2020 pact wasn't a minor technical document. It governed trillions of dollars in annual trade, tariff-free movement of everything from auto parts to farm equipment, and cross-border supply chains so tightly woven that a single vehicle could cross the Canada-U.S. border multiple times during assembly before it was ever sold. Disrupting that relationship wasn't just a matter of raising a number on a spreadsheet. It meant unwinding decades of industrial integration almost overnight. The early months of 2025 were chaotic. Steel, aluminum, and automobiles were pulled into the fight one after another. Provincial governments in Canada began pulling American liquor off government store shelves. A grassroots boycott movement spread across the country, with Canadians canceling trips south of the border and choosing homegrown brands over American ones at the grocery store. Reuters and the Associated Press both tracked a sustained drop in Canadian tourism to the United States throughout 2025, part of what analysts described as a broader souring of public opinion that outlasted any single round of tariffs. This wasn't a short skirmish. It became, in the words of multiple wire services covering it at the time, a trade war with no clear end date. By the summer of 2025, the tariff rate kept climbing. On July 31st, 2025, President Trump signed an order raising the general tariff on Canadian imports not covered by the existing free trade agreement from 25% to 35%, effective August 1st. In a letter to Prime Minister Mark Carney, Trump again cited fentanyl smuggling and what he called ongoing trade barriers. Carney's response was measured but pointed. He said his government was disappointed by the move, but noted that under the continuity of the North American Trade Agreement, commonly known by its acronym CUSMA on the Canadian side, the effective U.S. tariff rate on most Canadian goods actually remained among the lowest Washington applied to any major trading partner, because so much cross-border trade was still shielded by that agreement's exemptions. Carney wrote that Canada remained committed to CUSMA, calling it the world's second-largest free trade agreement by volume, while promising that sectors hit hardest, lumber, steel, aluminum, automobiles, would get direct government support. That distinction matters, and it's one that often gets lost in the noise. Even as headline tariff numbers went up, the majority of Canadian exports to the United States kept moving largely tariff-free because of that underlying trade pact. It's a detail Canadian officials would lean on again and again over the following year, arguing that Canada was never as exposed as the percentages in news headlines suggested. But for the industries that weren't shielded, for lumber mills in British Columbia, for auto parts plants in Ontario, for aluminum smelters in Quebec, the pain was real, and it built steadily, month after month, through the rest of 2025. Then came 2026, and the legal ground underneath the entire tariff regime began to shift. On February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down its ruling in a case called Learning Resources Inc. versus Trump. By a 6-3 vote, the justices ruled that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the same law the president had used back in February 2025 to justify the original Canada and Mexico tariffs, did not actually give the president authority to impose tariffs at all. It was a sweeping legal defeat for the White House's entire tariff strategy, striking at the constitutional foundation of measures that had, by that point, been in place for more than a year and had reshaped supply chains across North America. According to legal analysis published by the Canadian law firm Blake's, the ruling created immediate uncertainty about which tariffs would survive and which would have to be unwound, since dozens of executive orders had relied on that same emergency powers authority. The Learning Resources case itself was brought by a coalition of small and mid-sized American importers, along with a group of states, who argued that no emergency power statute passed by Congress in 1977 was ever meant to hand the executive branch open-ended authority to tax imports from virtually every country on Earth. The six-justice majority agreed, finding that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act's language about regulating commerce during a declared emergency did not extend to imposing tariffs, which the Constitution generally assigns to Congress in the first place. 3 justices dissented, arguing the emergency powers law had historically been read broadly enough to cover exactly this kind of executive action. That split matters because it foreshadows exactly the kind of legal argument now playing out again over Section 301. How much deference should courts give? A president using one statute after another to keep the same broad tariff policy alive. The administration did not simply drop the tariffs and move on. Instead, it pivoted to other legal tools already sitting in the U.S. Trade Code. One of those tools was Section 122 of the Trade Act, which allows the president to impose temporary tariffs of up to 15% for balance of payments reasons, but only for a limited period unless Congress specifically extends it. The administration leaned on Section 122 to keep tariff revenue flowing while the IEEPA-based measures were being litigated on appeal. The Court of International Trade later ruled that this use of Section 122 was itself improper, though that decision was paused pending appeal, letting the tariffs stay in effect in the meantime. It was, in other words, a legal patchwork. One emergency measure propping up the space left by another that had just been struck down. That patchwork had an expiration date, though, midnight on July 24, 2026, when the temporary Section 122 tariffs were set to lapse unless Congress acted. Congress did not act, but the tariffs didn't disappear. On the evening of July 23, 2026, just hours before the deadline, the Office of the United States Trade Representative announced a new set of tariffs under yet another section of trade law, Section 301, which is designed to combat what the statute calls unfair or discriminatory foreign trade practices. This time, the administration framed the tariffs as a response to forced labor in global supply chains, applying duties of 10 to 12, 5% on goods from 60 trading partners, including Canada, the moment the previous tariffs expired. According to reporting from CBC News, those 60 economies together account for roughly 99% of everything the United States imports. The timing, announced the evening before the old tariffs lapsed, became one of the central pieces of evidence in the legal fight that followed, because almost immediately that timing raised a very specific and very public question. If tariffs justified by an economic emergency had just been ruled unconstitutional by the nation's highest court, and if a separate emergency tariff authority was expiring by law, was this new forced labor justification a genuine trade remedy, or was it simply a new label pasted onto the same policy, timed precisely to avoid a single day without tariff revenue coming in? That question is exactly what landed 25 U.S. states in the Court of International Trade on August 3rd and August 4th, 2026. Led by New York Attorney General Letitia James, the coalition of Democratic-led states filed suit against the federal government, arguing that President Trump exceeded his statutory authority when he imposed the new Section 301 tariffs. According to CNBC's reporting on the filing, the states argued the tariffs were essentially a replacement for the sweeping duties already struck down by both the Supreme Court and the Court of International Trade, an attempt to keep the same policy running under a different legal label. Joining New York in the lawsuit were Arizona, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Kentucky, Massachusetts, Maryland, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Virginia, Vermont, Washington State, and Wisconsin, 25 states in total spanning the country from the Pacific Northwest to New England. After losing at the Supreme Court, the administration is once again trying to illegally raise taxes on families and businesses with a new round of tariffs, Attorney General James said when the lawsuit was announced, according to reporting carried by the Washington Times. That's a claim worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes the entire debate. For 18 months, the political conversation around these tariffs had largely centered on Canada, on Ottawa's retaliation, on Canadian boycotts, on cross-border tension. But the lawsuit filed against the federal government wasn't about protecting Canada. It was about American states arguing that American consumers and American businesses were the ones actually paying these costs, and that the executive branch didn't have the legal authority to keep imposing them. The core legal argument in the state's complaint, as described by CBC News, is that the federal government failed to adequately establish its case against each specific country named in the forced labor tariffs, and failed to explain how a blanket tariff on nearly all U.S. trading partners would actually eliminate the forced labor practices it claimed to be targeting, as Section 301 requires. In plain terms, the states argue this wasn't a carefully built trade case against 60 individual countries. It was, in their view, a single sweeping policy dressed up to look like 60 separate ones, filed the moment the previous legal justification ran out. The White House pushed back immediately and firmly. Spokesman Kush Desai defended the tariffs in a statement quoted by the Washington Times, saying, "The United States is using its lawful authority to obtain the elimination of unreasonable acts, policies, and practices that burden U.S. commerce, U.S. trade." Representative Jameson Greer went further at a Senate Finance Committee hearing, defending the administration's approach and specifically defending the threat of even higher tariffs on Canada, while Democrats on the committee moved separately to try to strip tariff-setting authority away from the president altogether. Greer's office has repeatedly argued, in public statements reported by outlets including CBC, that Section 301 has proven to be, in his words, a legally durable tool, going back to the tariffs the first Trump administration placed on China years earlier, and that it will hold up in court the way those earlier tariffs did. That legal history matters. Section 301, tariffs on Chinese goods imposed during Trump's first term, did survive court challenges. So when the administration says this tool is durable, it isn't an empty boast. It's pointing to precedent. But the state's lawsuit argues this situation is different in kind, not just degree, because the scale is so much larger, the timing so tightly linked to the expiration of a separate, already invalidated authority, and the justification, in their telling, thinner than what due process under the statute requires. There's also a separate parallel track worth understanding: Congress itself. At the same Senate Finance Committee hearing, where U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer defended the threat of 50% tariffs on Canadian goods, Senate Democrats introduced legislation aimed at stripping the president's tariff-setting authority altogether, or at minimum requiring congressional approval before duties of this scale could be imposed or extended. That effort reflects a broader bipartisan unease that has built in Congress since early 2025. Even some Republican lawmakers from farm states and manufacturing-heavy districts have quietly pushed back on tariff policy that raises costs for their own constituents, though most have stopped short of publicly breaking with the administration. Whether that legislative effort goes anywhere is genuinely uncertain. Similar bills introduced earlier in the trade war did not make it out of committee. But it underscores that the state's lawsuit isn't happening in isolation. It's one front in a wider struggle between the executive and legislative branches over who actually controls American trade policy. It's also worth understanding why states have legal standing to sue over tariffs in the first place. State governments aren't just political entities, they're also economic actors. They import goods for state agencies, universities, and public institutions, and they collect sales and business tax revenue tied directly to the health of in-state industries that rely on cross-border trade. When tariffs raise costs for a Vermont maple syrup exporter, a Michigan auto parts supplier, or a Washington state apple grower shipping into Canada, that ripple shows up in state tax receipts and state unemployment claims. Attorneys general in states like New York and California have argued in this case, as they did in earlier tariff litigation, that this direct economic harm gives them standing to challenge federal tariff policy in court, separate from any private company's ability to sue on its own. Meanwhile, Canada's own experience with this latest round of tariffs looked from the outside almost anticlimactic, and that contrast is itself part of the story. According to CBC News, reporting from early August 2026, there was comparatively little panic in Canada over the new forced labor tariffs of up to 5%, because roughly 90% of Canadian exports to the United States remained exempt under CUSMA. Canada's trade minister publicly rejected the framing of the forced labor tariff altogether, telling reporters that Canada already has, in the minister's words, some of the strongest labor protections of any trading partner the U.S. deals with. Prime Minister Carney, asked whether a broader trade deal with Washington might arrive before the new tariffs took hold, gave a characteristically cautious answer: "We'll see." That caution followed months of whiplash. Just 2 weeks before the state's lawsuit was filed on July 21st, 2026, Trump had signed a separate order imposing 50% tariffs on a specific list of Canadian goods: wine, dairy products, cement, furniture, and ice hockey equipment among them, using Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a Depression-era statute that allows tariffs up to 50% on countries the president determines are discriminating against you. S. Commerce. According to Forbes' coverage of the announcement, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer accused Canada of retaliating against American efforts to rebalance trade, specifically pointing to Canadian provinces pulling U.S. alcohol from government-run liquor stores, expanded European access to Canada's dairy market compared to American access, and caps on U.S. dairy imports. Those 50% tariffs were scheduled to take effect 30 days after signing, and notably, they applied even to some goods that had previously been shielded under CUSMA. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, one of the most vocal Canadian officials throughout the entire trade war, responded on social media with a line that captured the mood among many Canadian provincial leaders. "I'll never stop fighting to protect Ontario. If these tariffs proceed, Canada should respond tariff for tariff, dollar for dollar." It was the same defiant posture Ford had struck repeatedly since early 2025 when he first began publicly clashing with the Trump administration over the auto sector. But just one day after signing that 50% tariff order on July the 22nd, 2026, Carney announced something that surprised some observers. He and Trump had agreed, in a phone call that morning, to intensify and speed up trade negotiations over the following weeks. Now, I spoke this morning with the U.S. president, and we agreed to deepen and speed up our negotiations over the next few weeks, Carney said in Ottawa, according to Fortune's reporting on the call. He added that Canada would do all that is necessary to support our jobs, our workers, our farmers, and to make Canada stronger, more independent, and more resilient. It was a pattern that had repeated throughout the trade war. Maximum pressure from Washington, sharp public criticism from Ottawa and the provinces, followed almost immediately by both sides signaling a willingness to keep talking. Neither side, it seemed, actually wanted a permanent rupture, even as the tariff numbers kept climbing on paper. Financial analysts tracking the July 2026 round of Section 338 tariffs, including economists quoted in Fortune's coverage, noted that chemicals, plastics, electronics, and industrial equipment appeared to be among the hardest hit categories, followed by consumer goods and forestry products, with miscellaneous manufacturing machinery and select agricultural products rounding out the list. British Columbia Premier David Eby was blunt in his own public criticism of both Trump personally and the tariffs themselves, reflecting how deeply the trade dispute had penetrated provincial politics well beyond the federal government in Ottawa. By this point, tariff policy wasn't just a story about the White House and the Prime Minister's office. It was shaping elections, budgets, and public sentiment in Ontario, British Columbia, Quebec, and beyond. Quebec's government, heavily reliant on aluminum smelting and softwood lumber exports, had been pressing Ottawa since early 2025 for direct federal support for its industrial base, arguing that smelters in the Saguenay region were absorbing some of the steepest cost increases of any Canadian industry caught in the dispute. Alberta, by contrast, found itself in a somewhat different position because energy products were explicitly excluded from several rounds of tariffs, including those July 2026 Section 338 measures, which meant the province's oil and gas sector was comparatively insulated even as other parts of the Canadian economy absorbed direct hits. That uneven impact across provinces became its own political flashpoint within Canada, with premiers in the hardest hit regions arguing that Ottawa's national response wasn't accounting fully for how unevenly the pain was actually distributed. On the American side, the economic picture was similarly uneven. Border states with deep manufacturing ties to Canada, Michigan with its integrated auto sector, New York with cross-border agricultural and industrial trade, Washington State with its own agricultural exports northward, found themselves disproportionately exposed to retaliatory Canadian tariffs and to the rising cost of Canadian inputs used in American manufacturing. It's not a coincidence that Michigan, New York, and Washington all appear among the 25 states that joined the August 2026 lawsuit. These aren't simply states making an abstract legal point about executive authority. They're states whose own manufacturers, farmers, and exporters have been directly absorbing costs from a trade war waged, at least officially, on their behalf. It's worth pausing here to underline something the lawsuit itself is really about, because it's easy to lose track of amid all the percentages and section numbers. Tariffs, as a matter of basic economics, are paid by the importer at the border, meaning American companies bringing Canadian lumber, Canadian aluminum, Canadian wine, or Canadian auto parts into the United States are the ones writing the check to you. Customs and Border Protection, not the Canadian companies selling those goods. Whether and how much of that cost then gets passed on to American consumers through higher prices is a matter of ongoing economic debate, but the initial payment obligation falls squarely on you. Businesses. That is precisely the argument at the heart of Attorney General James's statement. American families and American businesses, not the Canadian government, are the ones directly absorbing the cost of tariffs imposed in the name of pressuring Canada. Economists tracking the dispute have also pointed to a broader inflationary ripple that's harder to attribute to any single tariff order, but shows up across the whole 18-month period. When the cost of imported lumber, steel, aluminum, and manufacturing inputs rises simultaneously across dozens of industries, that pressure tends to show up gradually in consumer prices, for everything from new homes to vehicles to household goods, even when a specific tariff was aimed at a narrow category of goods like wine or cement. Multiple outlets covering the dispute throughout 2025 and into 2026, including wire service reporting, picked up by both American and Canadian networks, noted that construction industry groups in the U.S. specifically flagged softwood lumber tariffs as a contributor to elevated home building costs, since a significant share of the lumber used in American residential construction has historically come from Canadian mills. None of this proves a precise, agreed-upon dollar figure for how much American households have paid because of this specific trade dispute. That kind of clean attribution is notoriously difficult in economics, where dozens of factors move prices at once, but it does help explain why state governments, not just Canadian officials, have increasingly framed this as a story about the cost landing on their own residents. There's also a diplomatic dimension worth noting, because tariffs didn't stay contained to trade policy alone. Reporting from Global News highlighted how Trump, at one point in the broader dispute, publicly linked ongoing trade negotiations with Canada to Canada's foreign policy positions, including its stance on Palestinian statehood. An unusual coupling of trade and geopolitics that drew criticism from trade policy analysts who argued it complicated an already difficult negotiation by adding unrelated diplomatic conditions into the mix. Carney's government pushed back on linking the two issues directly, while continuing to emphasize that Canada intended to remain committed to CUSMA regardless of how the broader relationship evolved. Canada's response to the accumulating pressure wasn't limited to retaliatory tariffs and public statements either. Throughout 2025 and into 2026, Carney's government pursued a deliberate strategy of diversifying Canada's trade relationships beyond the United States, deepening economic ties with the European Union and the United Kingdom, and pushing to reduce long-standing barriers to trade between Canada's own provinces, an effort to make the domestic Canadian market function more like a single unified economy, rather than a patchwork of provincial trade rules that had, for generations, made it easier for a Canadian company to trade with a U.S. state than with a neighboring province. Analysts describe this as part of a broader Canadian strategy to reduce reliance on the American market long-term, even while both governments kept negotiating in the short term. Whether that diversification meaningfully reduces Canada's economic dependence on the United States is itself a longer-term, unresolved question. America remains, by a wide margin, Canada's largest trading partner, and undoing decades of integration doesn't happen in 18 months, however sustained the political will behind it. That's the twist buried in the title of this story. When the tariff campaign against Canada began back in February 2025, the working assumption, publicly stated many times by the administration, was that pressure on Ottawa would force Canadian concessions, and that any economic pain would land north of the border. 18 months later, it's not Ottawa suing Washington. It's 25 American state governments suing their own federal government, arguing that the bill for this trade war has been landing on American soil the entire time. Whether that argument succeeds in the Court of International Trade, the same court, notably, that already ruled against the administration's use of Section 1 and 22 earlier in 2026, is now a live legal question with enormous financial stakes. The state's lawsuit specifically asks the court not just to block the tariffs going forward, but to order the government to refund duties already paid, a request that, if granted across 60 countries and hundreds of billions of dollars in trade, would represent one of the largest tariff refund actions in American history. There's one more layer worth mentioning before getting to what's still unresolved: the sheer number of legal fronts now running simultaneously. Beyond the 25 state lawsuit over Section 301, the Section 122 ruling from earlier in 2026 remains under appeal, meaning there are effectively two separate tariff-related cases moving through the federal court system at once, each capable of reshaping the tariff landscape independently of the other. Trade lawyers interviewed by Canadian outlets have described the situation as unusually tangled even by the standards of modern trade litigation, with overlapping statutes, overlapping court rulings, and overlapping appeals, creating genuine uncertainty about which tariffs, if any, will still be standing a year from now. That complexity is part of why neither side, not the White House, not the 25 states, not the Canadian government, has been willing to predict with confidence how this ultimately resolves. It's also worth being honest about what remains genuinely uncertain here, because not every piece of this story is settled fact. The outcome of the 25 state lawsuit had not been decided at the time this was reported, and legal experts are divided on how the Court of International Trade, and potentially the Supreme Court, again on appeal, will treat Section 301 differently from the IEPA authority already struck down. The administration's own characterization of Canada's trade practices as discriminatory is a contested claim, not an agreed-upon fact. It's the U.S. Trade Representative's position, disputed directly by Canada's Trade Minister and by Prime Minister Carney's government, which maintains that Canadian labour and trade protections are among the strongest of any U.S. partner. And while multiple named sources, CENTCOM is not relevant here, but CNBC, CBC News, the Associated Press, Reuters-sourced wire reporting, the Washington Times, Forbes, Fortune, and the Blake's Law Firm's legal analysis all corroborate the sequence of tariff orders, court rulings, and the state's lawsuit itself. The eventual dollar impact on either country's economy remains an estimate, not a confirmed final figure, and will likely keep shifting as negotiations between Washington and Ottawa continue. It's also worth noting how unusual this moment is in the broader history of American trade policy. Lawsuits over tariffs are not new. Companies challenge specific duties in the Court of International Trade fairly regularly, and individual industries have long lobbied against tariffs they consider harmful. But a coordinated lawsuit from 25 state governments, spanning both coasts and the industrial Midwest, explicitly challenging a sitting president's trade authority twice within the same year, is genuinely rare in modern American history. It reflects, according to legal analysts quoted across multiple outlets covering the case, a level of institutional pushback against unilateral executive trade action that hasn't been seen at this scale in decades. Whether that pushback ultimately reshapes how much authority any future president has to impose tariffs without direct congressional approval may end up being one of the most consequential long-term outcomes of this entire dispute, arguably more consequential than the fate of any single tariff on Canadian wine or lumber. For everyday people trying to follow this story, the practical stakes are fairly direct. If the states win and the Court of International Trade blocks the Section 301 tariffs, American businesses that import Canadian goods could see costs drop, and depending on how any refund order is structured, some companies could recover money already paid at the border. If the administration wins, or if the case drags on for months or years through appeals, the current tariff structure stays in place, and businesses on both sides of the border continue planning around costs that could still change again at any point, given how frequently the legal and political landscape has shifted since February 2025. That uncertainty is, in some ways, its own economic cost. Companies making long-term investment decisions, whether in a Michigan auto plant or an Ontario aluminum smelter, have had to do so for a year and a half without knowing what the tariff environment will look like even 6 months out. What is confirmed, and worth restating plainly, Canada was hit with escalating U.S. tariffs starting February 2025, rising from 25% to 35% over the following 18 months, with a further 50% sectoral tariff added under Section 338 in July 2026. The Supreme Court struck down the original legal basis for those tariffs in February 2026. The administration replaced that basis first with Section 122, then, as that expired, with Section 301 forced labor tariffs affecting Canada and 59 other trading partners starting July 24, 2026. And on August 3rd and 4, 2026, 25 U.S. states sued the federal government over that latest round, arguing it was an illegal attempt to keep the same tariff regime running under a new legal label. Those are the facts, as reported by named checkable sources. What happens next? In the courtroom, in Ottawa's ongoing negotiations with Washington, and in the pocketbooks of American importers and Canadian exporters alike, is still being written. So here's where it's worth turning the question back to you. When a trade policy built to pressure a foreign government ends up being challenged by the president's own states on the grounds that American businesses and American families are the ones actually footing the bill, who do you think has the stronger argument? The administration, defending its authority to use trade law aggressively against unfair practices, or the 25 states arguing that authority has been stretched well past what the law allows? Is this really about forced labor and discriminatory trade barriers? Or is it about who ultimately controls tariff policy in the United States? The White House, or the courts, or Congress? Leave your take in the comments, because this is genuinely one of those stories where reasonable people are landing in very different places. Before you go, 3 things that actually help this channel keep doing this kind of deep dive reporting. First, if you found this breakdown useful, hit that like button. It's a small action, but it tells the algorithm this is the kind of story worth showing to more people who care about it. Second, subscribe if you haven't already, because this trade dispute is far from over. The Court of International Trade hasn't ruled yet, and there will be more developments worth covering as Washington and Ottawa keep negotiating. Third, drop a comment with your prediction. Will the states win this case? Will Washington and Ottawa reach a deal before the courts even rule? Or does this keep dragging into 2027? Your comments genuinely shape which angles get covered next, so don't just scroll past. One last thing worth sitting with. Trade disputes like this one rarely end with a single dramatic ruling or a single signed agreement. More often, they end the way this one likely will, through a slow accumulation of court decisions negotiated carve-outs, quiet diplomatic phone calls, and gradual political pressure from businesses and voters on both sides of the border who simply want predictability back. Carney's government has said repeatedly it wants a durable long-term agreement rather than another temporary truce. The Trump administration has said it wants trade rules it considers fair, backed by tools it considers durable, and 25 state governments now want a court to decide who actually gets to make that call in the first place. All three of those positions can't fully win at once, which is exactly why this story isn't close to finished. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking this one as it develops.